Alrighty, this is lecture number 2, and you may be wondering, well, why are we looking at warm up, cool down, and stretching? Well, when we examined uh, our exercise science curriculum a few years back, one of the things that we discovered was that we were doing a pretty good job of covering most aspects, but the importance of warm up and cool down and the different types of stretching that gets used during those phases of an exercise routine were hit on in 201 a little bit more in 320, but really didn't get a full coverage. And that was, that's something that we're trying to do as an exercise science faculty is impart the importance of warm up and cool down, so that the students that are graduating from our with our exercise science degree, regardless of what career they're going on to, they are going to relay that importance on to individuals that they end up working with. So most of the time when you talk about warm up and cool down, you don't really get into a lot of the physiologic detail, but we are going to do that in this particular lecture. So obviously when we talk about warm up and cool down, we're focusing quite a bit on flexibility. And usually when you are talking about flexibility and the changes that you're seeing in flexibility with warm up and cool down, when you refer to warm up, it's usually thought of as a transient improvement in flexibility, or a temporary improvement in flexibility that allows for increased safety and increased effectiveness of movement. It's the flexibility training that you do in cool down that gives you more of a permanent or solid increase in flexibility that you're going to see across the course of time. It's not that warm up stretching can't help with that permanent improvement, but the stretching that we do in cool down, as we'll talk about, tends to have more of a permanent effect, or more of a long-term effect, rather than the transient effect that it has in warm up. All right, so when you're talking about flexibility, you're obviously gonna have to talk about range of motion, and range of motion, of course, has a static component to it and a dynamic component to it. And static flexibility is where you're looking at, how much movement do you have around a joint during a passive movement, whereas dynamic flexibility is the available range of motion that you might see during more active movements, where there's a lot more voluntary muscle action that's taking place. And the question that always comes up here is, which one is easier to measure? Which one is easier to collect data on, static flexibility or dynamic flexibility? And the answer to that, of course, is static flexibility, because tests like the sit and reach test, or the back scratch test, or using a goniometer to measure flexibility at the shoulder, or flexibility at the hip, flexibility at the knee, et cetera, et cetera. Those are measurements of static flexibility. A dynamic flexibility is much harder to quantify, and is usually more of a subjective measure as opposed to an objective measure, like the sit and reach or goniometer measurements, et cetera. But when you look at the importance of static range of motion versus dynamic range of motion, it's not that static range of motion doesn't contribute to overall success or lack of success when you're talking about physical activity, but dynamic flexibility has much more of an impact on the success that people have during athletic contests, as well as during activities of daily living. Hard to quantify, but still has a higher level of overall importance to physical success. And there's a lot of different factors that affect flexibility, both dynamic flexibility as well as static flexibility. One is the joint structure, and you guys have probably talked about this in several different classes, and usually the example that's given is the comparison between the hinge joint and the ball and socket joint. You've got hinge joints at your knee and your elbow, you've got ball and socket joints at your shoulder and your hip. And the structure of those joints dictates how much flexibility you're going to have. And generally, a ball and socket joint is going to have a greater range of motion than does a hinge joint. Hinge joints generally are going to go in one direction, forward and backward, or up and down, or however you want to characterize it. Whereas the ball and socket joint allows for more of a 360 degree of range of motion look. Of course, when you're talking about the stability of those joints and their susceptibility to injury, the hinge joints are a lot more stable. There's a lot more collagen versus elastin in those joints, whereas the ball and socket joints, they're a little more unstable. They have a lot more elastin than collagen. That's kind of getting into the connective tissue issue in point number 2 here. But the susceptibility of injury, it's not a black and white type of concept where you're like, okay, yeah, your ball and socket joints are much more susceptible to injury than the hinge joints. It really depends on how those joints are being used and how those joints are being tweaked, because a hinge joint, like a knee joint, if it moves side to side, there's a great chance of injury there. Whereas a ball and socket joint moving side to side, you've got a lot more leeway. But when it comes to being able to hold that joint in place and hold that joint stable, obviously the hinge joint is going to have a greater degree of success there, and that might contribute to a lessened chance of injury in that circumstance. So it really just depends on what you're doing as far as how injury susceptible those different types of joints are. So I already mentioned the connective tissue. When we age, we typically lose flexibility, and that's tied in with your activity level. You tend to become less and less active as you get older, and that contributes to a greater incidence of contracture within the connective tissue particularly, but also in the muscle tissue to a more limited degree. An active person, no matter the age, tends to be much more flexible, and doesn't really matter what activity they're doing, although activities with a higher degree of range of motion obviously are going to contribute to a greater maintenance of flexibility in those circumstances. But activity alone is not going to improve flexibility significantly. You have to engage in active stretching procedures that we'll talk about when we get to cool down. That's what's really going to contribute to your overall ability to improve flexibility. But the flexibility can be maintained just by staying as active as you can. Now, you can't account for all of the age-related flexibility loss just from the reduction in activity. There is some natural age-related changes that are going to occur with as a person gets older, with those connective tissue bits and the muscle tissue itself. With gender, females on the whole tend to be more flexible than males. They tend to have more, they tend to have a greater range of motion in most circumstances. There are some exceptions to that, but females do tend to be more flexible than males. A lot of that goes away when females go through menopause, because some of that gender-related flexibility difference is a hormonal issue, where estrogen has a very powerful impact on flexibility and the pliability of our muscles and connective tissue. And once you go through menopause, of course, you lose that estrogen production and release, and that can contribute overall to females becoming more like males when it comes to their flexibility. Okay, anybody who resistance trains with a limited range of motion, where they're not taking a muscle group all the way through a range of motion for a specific exercise, they tend to develop a lower degree of flexibility for that motion. In some cases, they don't care because it doesn't impact the performance of the activity that they are trying to do. Weightlifters are a classic example of this. In many cases, they don't need a huge amount of flexibility. In fact, bigger amounts of flexibility might detract from the amount of power that they can create. But more average people are encouraged to resistance train with full range of motion in order to maintain that range of motion for activities of daily living. Any type of excess mass, whether it be muscle, whether it be fat, can interfere with how the limbs move around their axis of rotation. Generally, fat mass is going to be more of an inhibitor of movement, but muscle bulk can also play a role there. And that's one reason why people who resistance train on a regular basis, who are trying to maintain the range of motion, are encouraged to engage in stretching activities along with that resistance training, those resistance training activities. All right, so as we talked about, warm-up is considered to be a transient or a temporary change or increase in flexibility. And if you ask the average person on the street, why do you want to warm up? And what's the reason? And usually what they'll say is so that you don't hurt yourself. And that is absolutely the case. But as you'll see, as we're going through this laundry list of advantages to warm up, safety is one aspect, but the effectiveness of movement, your success in the physical activity that you are engaging in, has a great deal to do with why a warm-up is so important. And think about what happens when you first get out of bed in the morning and you don't feel super flexible. You don't feel like you could, take your body through a full range of motion. You feel a little sluggish, you feel a little tight, and it's not until you move around a little bit that you start to see that improvement in flexibility and range of motion that you're more accustomed to throughout an average day. And that can be worsened by the type of activity you may have been doing the day before, increasing muscle soreness, contracture of the connective tissue, that type of thing. So, that getting up out of bed and moving around your apartment or your house or walking to class or whatever, that is a part of warm-up. That can be considered to be a warm-up for your body, not usually considered to be a warm-up for a specific type of exercise, physical activity, or sport, but it can be considered to be a warm-up. All right, so one of the first things that we see, of course, is that our muscle and connective tissue become more pliable. They become more loose. They become more stretchable. And the increase in temperature that we see within those tissues has a great deal to do with why they become more pliable. And the analogy of the stick of gum is a good one here, where you pull that stick of gum out of the package. If you were to pull on that stick of gum at that point, it would pull apart. It would snap relatively easily. Whereas if you put it, you pop it in your mouth and you chew it for a while and you warm it up and you take it back out and stretch it, it's going to be a lot more pliable. It's going to be a lot more elastic, and your muscle tissue and your connective tissue are very similar to that piece of gum, that when you warm them up, the chances of them snapping, the chances of them tearing are much less in that circumstance. So increasing that pliability is a big thing. Our joints at rest generally don't have a lot of synovial fluid in them. The joints of very sedentary people don't have a lot of synovial fluid. And when you are active, when you start to move around, your joints will release synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid acts like kind of the oil in your car, where it serves as a lubricant, and it eases the articulation of bones. It eases the articulation in general at the joints, and it also serves to assist cartilage in providing cushioning of those joints. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people, especially older folks, they get up out of bed in the morning, and sometimes those first few steps are relatively painful because they don't have a whole lot of synovial fluid in those joints, and the amount of cushioning, the amount of padding they have there is not great. But that gradually eases the more movement that they get for the most part. And that synovial fluid is a real important aspect of reducing pain, especially in older individuals. And this was shown in a study that was done using 3 different relatively large nursing homes, where there was an initial study done where they looked at hydration levels, and what they found was the hydration levels in a lot of the residents in the nursing home were lower than they really should be. And it was theorized that that was contributing to a lot of the pain that those individuals were feeling. So what they ended up doing was they basically split those nursing homes down the middle according to age. So they had 2 groups that were well matched age-wise and activity-wise. And they had one group that amped up slowly but surely over the course of 3 months the amount of fluid that they were ingesting. And in addition to that, they had them do pain scales for different areas of the body, judging the amount of pain that they were feeling in their knees, in their back, in their shoulders, all different areas of the body. And what they noted was at the end of that 3 months, the recognized, or the pain that was felt by the individuals that were becoming more hydrated over that 3 months was lower. Their ratings of pain were consistently lower across the board, with a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, it was the case, and that led to a pretty big change in that industry, where nursing homes started to focus more and more on hydration levels in those individuals. Now, when you're increasing the amount of fluid, especially in an older person, you want to make sure you're not doing that too fast, because that can cause bloating, but that can also cause issues with an increased necessity to go to the bathroom, which can be problematic in that population too. So it needs to be a gradual increase. And honestly, that's the case for any age, but older individuals tend to struggle a little bit more with that. Bottom line is that your body is going to adjust to the increased amount of fluid, and if you do it slowly and gradually, you're not going to see as much of an impact on their average amount of time that they're having to use the restroom. Okay, the shock of exercise can be defined in a number of ways. One is the shock on the muscles and connective tissue. They're much less likely to tear and be injured when they are warmed up properly, but the shock of exercise can also be relatable to the cardiovascular system as well, where the cardiovascular system doesn't like to be shocked. It doesn't like to go from a seated position or a lying down position into a full-on sprint. It can do that. It is capable of doing that, but it's not the preferred method. The cardiovascular system likes to be warmed up gradually, just like any other. And people who are susceptible, especially electrically, to problems within the cardiovascular system, they can have some pretty serious consequences from an overactivation of the cardiovascular system, causing an overload within those nervous system tissues in the cardiovascular system, and thus a shutdown of those areas, resulting in a heart attack, which obviously you want to avoid that in those populations. So a nice, slow, gradual warm up whenever you can get it is the way to go. All right, so we've talked more about the safety aspect, reduction of pain, etc. But when you warm up muscle, the nervous system moves faster. Nervous system signals are more consistent and they are quicker in warmed up muscle than they are in non-warmed up muscle. So you have faster contraction and relaxation speeds in both agonist and antagonist muscles in warmed up tissue. And that, of course, is going to contribute to a faster production of power and a more consistent production of power across the course of time, which can be very beneficial for any type of physical activity. And that, of course, is outlined in number 5 and number 6. Reaction time is improved, and how much force you can create, how much power you can create, force in a short amount of time is dramatically improved in that warmed up muscle. All right, so obviously, if we're improving the nervous system, we also want to improve blood flow. We talked about the need to gradually warm up the cardiovascular system. Part of that is we want to make sure we're getting enough blood flow to the muscles, because we need to bring in oxygen and nutrients. We need to get rid of waste. So if we can improve that blood flow to those working tissues, that's going to help us improve our ability to have the blood do what it needs to do during that time. It's also going to help us to unload oxygen at the tissue level. And that's those of you who were in 420 as well as 421 know that we talked about the Bohr effect in 420, relatable to how we are getting oxygen off of hemoglobin. And higher temperatures within our working areas, our working tissues, that helps to bring oxygen off of hemoglobin, get it into our cells so it can be used for metabolism, which then, of course, frees up hemoglobin to be able to transport carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion away from the body. It also helps us to maintain our myoglobin stores by getting more of that oxygen off of hemoglobin, where if it's not used, it can be stored on myoglobin. All right, metabolic reactions. Any reaction is going to go faster in warmed up tissue. Why? Because enzymes love a little bit of warmth. And they operate much faster. They're much more active in a warmer environment. Now, there is a limit to that because enzymes are made up primarily of proteins. And proteins are sensitive to temperature. If temperature goes too high, those proteins can denature. And a denatured protein is not going to operate the way it needs to. Thus, that enzyme may become non-functional in a tissue that is over warm. And that's one of the reasons why we try to maintain our body temperature within a certain zone, so that we are getting that improvement in enzyme release, that improvement in enzyme activity, speeding up those metabolic reactions, getting us more ATP where we need it. And that, of course, is obviously going to help us to enhance our waste removal as well, because we're going to get that improved blood flow. We're going to get that improved availability of hemoglobin for the transport of waste. But we're also going to do one thing we haven't talked about yet, which is increase our breathing rate. You ask the person off the street, why do we increase breathing rate during exercise? Well, we got to get more oxygen in. Well, yeah, we do, but that's usually not the issue. Usually our oxygen saturation is fine. Usually the issue is getting it unloaded at the tissue level. But being able to breathe off our CO2 and thus buffer our hydrogen ion is a bigger key to why we increase our breathing rate during exercise. And that's really what's going to enhance our waste removal the most. All right, so when we warm up, and warm up is gonna vary depending on what type of activity we're planning to do for our bout of exercise, whether it's competing in a sport, whether it's resistance training, whether we're going for a jog, whether we're going for a bike ride. Our warm up is going to vary a little bit, but one thing that doesn't vary at all is phase one, which is a general warm up using light aerobic activity to begin to wake up those muscles that we're going to use at a much higher level. And you want that aerobic activity to mimic as closely as possible the type of exercise that you are going to be doing, so that you're starting to use those muscle groups at a lighter level, slowly but surely increasing the pace, increasing the intensity across the course of 3 to 5 minutes in order to increase the amount of activity that we are seeing in those muscles. So obviously, with that question that appears at the bottom of the slide, what happens during that phase? All of those things that we talked about on the previous 2 slides, those all happen during a general aerobic warm-up. And again, you can use whatever mode of aerobic activity you want, but you want it to try to mimic as closely as possible the activities that you're going to be doing during that more intense bout of exercise that you're probably heading into if you're getting your body warmed up, whether it's, you know, exercise in general, or whether it's sport, or whether you're doing, you know, an activity of daily living or yard work or whatever. You want it to try to mimic that as best you can. Speaking of mimicking, when we get to the phase 2 of warm up, that's our dynamic stretching. And our dynamic stretching is all based off of the activity that you're going to do during that more active, more intense phase. And dynamic stretching, this is where you're going to see the greatest amount of variability, and it really should be dictated. The movements that you use for your dynamic stretches should be dictated by the activity that you are going to do. So if you're going to be raking leaves, you want your dynamic movements to mimic the action of raking leaves, picking them up, carrying them to a burn pile, you know, all of those things. You should be warming those muscles up. Same thing can be said for sport, and the same thing can be said for resistance training. So when we resistance train, we want our dynamic movements to mimic the exercises that we're going to do that day during our resistance training session. And this is one of the hardest things that or hardest bits of information to convey to our Strong Survivor staff members, or to our Strong Survivors participants. Our staff members are trying to convey it to the participants, is the type of movements that they should be doing. Because we do have a workout manual that our participants receive, and in that workout manual are a lot of the pictures that you see in your lecture. And what we usually do, like for instance with our class out at Johnny and Logan, is we will do a group warm up to start, and we'll do that for a couple of sessions. And even though we continually say, you know, you want your dynamic movements to mimic what you're going to do resistance training wise, what we eventually will see once the class is over, or once they're no longer under the tutelage of a Strong Survivor staff member who's going to ensure that the dynamic movements they're doing mimic the resistance training activities they're going to do that day. What we end up seeing is that they'll revert back to what's in the workout manual, which, hey, that is better than doing no dynamic movements at all, but it doesn't get those muscle groups targeted specifically enough, which is what you are trying to do. One thing to remember, just jumping back one slide here, is to remember to, if you're using an exercise bike for your light aerobic activity, and you're planning to use your upper body during whatever it is you're going to be doing that day, you want to make sure you're moving the upper body, pumping those arms while you're riding on that exercise bike. If it doesn't have those handholds that allow you to move your upper body, you want to make sure you're moving the upper body, because generally with an exercise bike, all you're moving is your legs. So you gotta bring the upper body into it in order to make sure that you are making that happen. So you're warming up both the upper body the mid torso, the core, and the lower body. All right, so with resistance training, we're mimicking those resistance training movements. So look at the motion, look at the stretch shortening cycle requirements of that sport or those activities, and then get your dynamic movements to mimic those activities so that you are targeting those ranges of motion. You're targeting those stretch shortening cycle requirements, and most importantly, you're targeting those muscles and you're waking them up. And you can see from phase 1 to phase 2, we get more specific. Whereas we are just generally warming up the body in phase 1, phase 2 with dynamic stretching is more of a specific wake-up call for the muscles we are about to use. Regardless, your pace should be slow, should be smooth, or should be slower, because slow is probably not the right word. But slower and smooth is the more important word. What we want to avoid is, kind of herky-jerky type of movements that might contribute to an overall increase in the amount of injury risk that you would see with those activities. Now, important to remember that if you are going for like a jog on the treadmill, for instance, you do your warm-up by starting off by walking and slowly but surely over the course of 3 to 5 minutes, increasing the pace until you get to your jogging speed, and then you go at your jogging speed for 20, 25 minutes, however long you're going to exercise for, and then you transition into your cool down. What I often see, especially out at Johnny Logan, is I see participants who have been in our class before, and they're working out at Logan on their own. And I know for a fact that they're not planning to do any resistance training activities that day. They're just planning to use the aerobic equipment. And I will observe them getting onto the treadmill, and they'll do, a walk first, slowly build up their pace, and do that for 3 to 5 minutes. Then they'll stop the treadmill, they'll get off, and they'll run through all the dynamic movements that are in their workout manual. And then they get back onto the treadmill and they start jogging. And I will usually wander over there and say, are you planning to do any resistance training activities today? And the answer is often, well, no, I'm just going to use the treadmill. I'm like, well, why did you get off the treadmill and do those dynamic movements from the workout manual? Like, well, that's what you taught us to do in the class. Well, what we taught you to do was target the range of motions and the energy systems and the stretch shortening cycle requirements of the activity that you are doing. Okay? Doing those dynamic movements doesn't really help you in that circumstance. In fact, it probably works against you, because you lose a little bit of that warm-up effect when you get off of the exercise implement that you're using. And so in that circumstance, you don't need to do any type of dynamic movements, because you're already doing those dynamic movements. If your plan is to go for a jog on a treadmill, or go for a bike ride, or use the elliptical machine, you just start out at a slower pace, work your way up over 3 to 5 minutes, and then you're at your exercise pace, and you just continue moving at that point. Now, at the bottom of the screen, it asks a couple questions about a potential phase 3 prior to a resistance training exercise. That would be, you do a dynamic movement without any weight, and then maybe you go to the actual piece of equipment that you're going to use resistance training wise, and you do a lighter amount of weight and a nice warm-up set. That serves as a good phase 3 for resistance training in that circumstance. Another question is, can you slow and static stretch prior to activity? Can you use that as a part of your warm-up? And the recommendation typically is, if you have an area of the body that is exceptionally tight, and you may want to do a little slow and static stretching with that after you get that general warm-up in. But then you got to remember that you're going to want to do more of that general warm up after you've done that slow and static stretching, so you can get your blood flow back up, you can get your body temperature back up, because it will lower when you do that slow and static stretching, because it is such a stationary non-movement or lower movement activity. And there is some evidence out there too that shows that slow and static stretching prior to power activities can diminish the amount of power that you're actually able to create in that circumstance, and is generally not recommended for those types of activities. All right, so we have a lot of pictures in here of dynamic stretches that you might want to do prior to resistance training or prior to any other type of sporting event or activity of daily living, yard work, housework, that type of thing. I'm going to flip through them relatively fast, but I want to give you a little assignment that we'll talk about initially on Thursday, and that is, what types of activities would each one of these dynamic movements be beneficial for? So flip through those pictures and come to class on Thursday prepared to talk about what types of activities, exercise-wise or sport-wise or yard work-wise or housework wise, would be beneficial for these specific movements that we see here. So like I said, I'm going to flip through them relatively quickly and move on to talking about cool down. But I want you guys to look at those pictures and think of some examples of activities those dynamic movements would be good to precede. All right. So we've gone through our warm-up, we've gone through our exercise phase, and we're moving now towards the end of exercise, and we want to engage in a proper cool down. Cool down is, without a doubt, the most skipped section of a typical exercise routine. There's lots of reasons for that. The number one reason, of course, is time. You've spent some time doing some resistance training, some aerobic training, got yourself warmed up properly, and then all of a sudden you look at the clock and you're like, oh, I got to get to my next appointment, or I got to get home to cook dinner, or I got to do whatever it is I have to do. I'll cool down later. I'll stretch later. And I've said that to myself numerous times, and it's not the way to go, but it unfortunately is the way that a lot of people go, because they do run out of time. Another reason is, especially with slow and static stretching, a lot of people don't necessarily like slow and static stretching because they don't like the sensation that they feel during slow and static stretching. A lot of people, if you're going to ask them what they prefer or what they can tolerate, the burn of exercise, like from resistance training, is more preferable to the type of discomfort that they feel during stretching. So for that reason, it's not as fun to do or whatever. A big piece that some people don't necessarily even think about is the fact that when you are engaging in flexibility training as a part of cool down, you're improving your flexibility. But can you show that off if you're just standing? If you're just, if you walk into a room, somebody walks into a room, can you look at that person and be like, whoa, that person's flexible? No, the only way you can tell they're flexible is if they show off their flexibility. And most people don't do that on the regular in a social situation. However, if they walk into the room, can you tell if they exercise on a regular basis, aerobic or resistance training? If they do aerobic training, they tend to look leaner. They tend to look healthier. If they do resistance training, their muscles tend to stand out a little bit more. Their clothes tend to fit a little bit more. They tend to have less body fat with both aerobic and resistance training. And so it's relatively obvious in those circumstances that someone is physically active. So from a body image standpoint, flexibility, range of motion is not as much of a motivation for people. So a lot of people will skip stretching because they don't get that body image boost out of being more flexible, even though it will help them to be more successful with the physical activity that will help them to look more healthy, to look better, more attractive, etc. They'll still skip it because it's uncomfortable. They don't have time. They don't get anything out of it aesthetically, and that so there's lots of reasons why cool down gets skipped. But why do we want to cool down? Well, especially after doing a lot of anaerobic activity, we have accumulated quite a bit of waste products because our blood flow, as opposed to aerobic activity, our blood flow during anaerobic activity is not as consistent. So if we can flush out waste products from our active tissues, that can help those active tissues to heal faster. That can help them to operate in a normal fashion faster. And there is a little bit of evidence that getting rid of those waste products can help to reduce muscle soreness, although there's more evidence that goes to show that the actual stretching routine itself, rather than the blood flow issue, the actual stretch is what helps to reduce muscle soreness. But that is yet another benefit. Okay, we can see, we talked about the shock of exercise from the beginning of exercise. Well, there can be a relaxation shock that can occur. This is typically going to be a little more common during high intensity or higher intensity aerobic activity. And you see this happen fairly frequently in individuals who are doing a VO2 max test. Because obviously with the VO2 max test, you're slowly but surely increasing the speed and grade of a treadmill or the pace and the resistance of an exercise bike or elliptical machine, whatever it happens to be. And by the end, you're exercising about as hard as you possibly can, and your blood flow is moving about as fast as it possibly can in that circumstance. And in many cases, people who are told, okay, you've reached your VO2 max, what do they tend to want to do? Because they're so tired, they're breathing so heavily. They want to get off the treadmill, or they want to stop pedaling, or they want to stop moving on the elliptical machine. And almost immediately, what happens, especially when you're doing upright exercise, when you're doing exercise when you're on your feet, if you stop moving, what happens? You lose the muscle pump in your legs. That muscle pump has been helping to squeeze the blood through the veins, get it back to the chest, where the ventilatory muscles can squeeze it the rest of the way to the heart, and thus reoxygenate it, get rid of waste, and help it to be delivered to the working tissues effectively, and also to deliver it to the brain. So your brain gets accustomed to a certain level of blood flow during physical activity. So what happens when you are physically active and then you stop exercising and your legs are no longer moving?
Hey, get back. Get back. Get back. No. Get back. Get back.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
All right, so you've had a little bit of time to consider that question about what happens when you are exercising at a high rate and you're using your legs a lot, and all of a sudden you stop using your legs. Well, like we mentioned before, the beagle break, you lose out on the muscle pump. that muscle pump is helping squeeze that blood back to the torso, which helps the ventilatory muscles squeeze it back to the heart, and which helps it get to the brain. And like we said, the brain gets used to a certain amount of blood flow during exercise. And if all of a sudden you stop exercising and your legs are still, what's going to happen? Gravity, which you've been fighting the entire time you've been exercising, is going to really take over. It's going to pull the blood down towards the lower body away from the brain. And the brain is going to say, hey, what happened to all that blood flow that I had during exercise? It's gone now. I need that blood flow back. So in many cases, you can have what's called post-exercise hypotension, which is a drop-off in blood pressure, a dramatic drop-off in blood pressure that's dictated by the effect of gravity pulling the blood towards the lower body in a very rapid fashion. You get rapid pooling of the blood in the lower body because your muscle pump is no longer moving it from the lower body up to the torso and so on and so forth. And you get a massive drop off in blood pressure. And that usually means that the brain will say, hey, if blood pressure is gone, I need to get my blood flow back. So how does it get its blood flow back? It takes gravity out of the equation, makes you faint. And thus, if you're either prone or supine, hey, you are in a situation where you you've taken gravity out of the equation, so the brain's getting plenty of blood flow. Unfortunately, in that situation, or really in any exercise situation, there's always a chance you're going to fall over on something when you faint, and you might crack your head, you might, break a limb, you might pull a muscle, you might do a lot of things that would be very negative. So that's an example of a relaxation shock issue, but you can have even more serious situations come up, especially in individuals who have cardiac issues, where you see a dramatic drop off in intensity, and that can trigger a cardiovascular event. It can trigger an actual heart attack because those electrical systems in the heart are very sensitive to change, and it can have just as much of an effect as it does when you dramatically increase intensity at the beginning of exercise. Dramatically decreasing it can have that same effect. And there's lots of evidence of people who get off of a treadmill and they have a heart attack, and it's this relaxation shock issue is a real thing. So you want to make sure that you're cooling down gradually, slowly returning yourself from exercise rates down to resting rates in all the systems of the body, including the cardiovascular system. That's really what cool down is all about, is that transition from exercise to rest. It is a great time for flexibility improvement because the muscles at that point are generally already warm, and you can really push the muscles. You can push the reduction in proprioreceptor activity that we normally see that's very active in a lot of people, because those proprioreceptors, of course, are sensitive to tension. They're sensitive to change in length. And when people are not appropriately flexible, or they have not engaged in regular flexibility training, those proprioreceptors are often overactive. And if they're overactive, that can mean that you have a situation where your range of motion is artificially limited, where you could have a greater range of motion, but the proprioreceptors don't allow for it. So what you're trying to do when you're stretching, when you're engaging in proprioreceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which we'll talk about in a minute, when you're engaging in slow and static stretching, you're basically trying to reset those proprioreceptors. And it's a great time to do that when the muscles and connective tissue are already warm. All right, we already talked about returning to resting activities effectively. Okay, so how is a cool down completed? Well, just like phase one of a warm-up, phase down of a cool down involves some aerobic activity. It's usually even lighter than what you do during a warm-up, and is more of a reduction, a gradual reduction in intensity level as you are engaging in that 2 to 3 minutes of very light aerobic activity. If it's at the end of a run or the end of a bike ride or an elliptical machine session, you just progressively reduce exercise intensity, speed, grade, resistance, pace, however you want to term that exercise intensity. You can reduce those factors and bring yourself gradually back down towards resting levels. Okay, one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier, but that can really be useful from a waste removal standpoint, especially following anaerobic activity, especially resistance training, is that you've built up a lot of that waste because blood flow is not as regular during resistance training. In fact, you restrict blood flow in a lot of ways during resistance training. So engaging in this very light aerobic activity increases blood flow and thus increases the removal of those waste products that you might have accumulated during that exercise phase, allowing for that tissue to operate at normal levels, to heal better. All of those things can be enhanced with that light aerobic activity. Phase 2, just like with warm-up, it's dynamic stretching. With cool down, it's more of a static style stretch, or a stationary style stretch. Either usually slow and static is the most preferred method, but we can also use PNF, proprioreceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a few slides. But slow and static is generally used the most because it is the safest way to stretch, and it's still a very effective way to stretch. PNF stretching can be a little more effective from a flexibility improvement standpoint, but slow and static stretching is much safer, and it's easier to execute because generally you don't need a partner in most circumstances. The idea is that you're going to take all the major muscle groups on both sides of the body, top and bottom, side to side, front to back, and you're going to stretch all of them. And if you have an area that is especially tight or especially sore, you can stretch it multiple times. Why do we call it slow and static? Because there is a slow phase and then there is a static phase. The slow phase is a slow stretch to usually a 10 count. You can obviously extend it beyond 10 if you wish, but a 10 count is usually sufficient. It needs to be nice and smooth. No herky-jerky movements. Nice and smooth from the start position to the finish position. What is the finish position? Well, that's the point where you feel that mild discomfort, where you feel the stretch. It's more of a dull, diffuse pain, not a sharp, severe pain. If you feel a sharp, severe pain, you need to stop immediately. A dull, diffuse pain is what we're looking for here. And again, that's that discomfort that a lot of people don't necessarily like about stretching. And this is, of all of the aspects of stretching, that is hardest to communicate to people, is what it should feel like when you stretch. Most people kind of have an idea of what that feels like, but trying to communicate it can often be kind of difficult. Okay, by the time you get to 8, 9, 10 in that slow count, you should really be in that finish position. Then you get to the static portion. So you're in the finish position and you hold it. It's a static position. There's no movement at all. You're holding it in place for 15 to 30 seconds. The longer you can hold it, okay, the more of that proprioreceptor reorganization or proprioreceptor reset you're going to get in that circumstance. Okay, because that's basically what you're doing, is you're stretching a little bit further each time, and you're resetting that proprioreceptor a little bit more each time. Of all of the types of fitness that you can work on, of all the types of exercise that you can do, flexibility training is the slowest. And that's maybe yet another reason why people skip it, is because they just don't see the benefits as quickly as they do with aerobic training, resistance training, balance, or agility training. It is definitely a slow and gradual process that requires a lot of patience. Okay, just like with resistance training, you need to breathe normally during stretching. That's going to do a couple of things for you. One is going to allow you to stretch further, because when you're breathing normally, you have much less tension overall in the body that can allow you to stretch that muscle and connective tissue a little bit further. And if you're not holding your breath, there's less of a chance of any kind of Valsalva maneuver related dizziness or lightheadedness or fainting in that circumstance. Because when you hold your breath, remember that your thoracic pressure goes up. It increases the pressure in the aorta outside the left ventricle, and it gets harder to push blood out of the left ventricle during contraction. And especially when you're in an upright standing position, that can contribute to a lowering of blood flow to the brain. And that can mean lightheadedness, dizziness, and possibility of fainting if you're not breathing normally. Again, you can repeat any stretch you want for multiple benefit. All right, there's lots of different stretches that are pictured, and I'm going to move through these relatively quickly, but I do want to answer this question at the bottom of this slide, which is how can the intensity of that stretch be increased? Obviously, by increasing the range of motion, and a lot of people have very tight muscles in the neck and shoulder area. They may not be able to rotate too far to the right or rotate to the left, or maybe they can rotate further on one side than the other. But you gradually want to increase the amount of intensity by increasing the amount of stretch. You can obviously add in a little more intensity by using the hands to move the head. And you could have a partner do that for you, or you can do it yourself. But that can help you to move that muscle through a greater range of motion, as opposed to just moving the head by itself using the muscles of the neck. All right, I'm going to move through these relatively quickly. Lots of examples of different muscle groups being stretched, including a few from our Strong Survivors exercise manual. Let you guys look through these on your own. All the major muscle groups are represented. And like we mentioned earlier, what we're going to finish with here is PNF, proprioreceptive neuromuscular facilitation. This is an active attack on those proprioreceptors, an active manipulation of those proprioreceptors. And because it is a manipulation and it is more of an active style of stretching, there is a greater chance of injury with this type of stretching. Plus, if you do too much too soon of this type of stretching, you can have a result of having muscle soreness that may be just as painful, just as significant, just as debilitating as soreness you might get from resistance training, because you end up moving your muscles and connective tissue through a much greater range of motion with PNF stretching. It's one of the reasons why it's more effective, but it's also another reason why there's a little bit more risk involved as far as muscle soreness and as far as greater amounts of muscle injury. There's two types of inhibition that you're trying to establish here: autogenic and reciprocal. With autogenic, you are actively contracting a muscle prior to passively stretching that muscle. And the idea is that you're trying to fool that proprioreceptor by contracting it first and then moving immediately into that passive stretch. With reciprocal inhibition, you contract the muscle that opposes the muscle that you are stretching. So the antagonist muscle is what you're contracting, because in many cases, the proprioreceptor activity is most powerful coming from that opposing muscle. And that's what keeps you from stretching the muscle you're trying to stretch as far as you might like to stretch it. So by contracting it, you're once again fooling the proprioreceptors in that opposing muscle, and then it allows you to stretch the muscle you want to stretch further in that passive stretch. Obviously, you're stimulating Golgi tendon organs, which is going to cause a greater muscle relaxation, allow a greater stretch. And again, we already talked about the soreness issue. Lots of different ways of doing this, but one of the most basic ways is the hold relax technique, where and generally having a partner, you can do this without a partner, but having a partner is generally going to be a more effective way of doing it, where you do basically like a slow and static stretch, the slow part of that motion for 10 seconds. Then you're going to hold that position isometrically, contract that muscle, for about 6 seconds, and then you're going to stretch further for another 30 seconds. So basically it's 10 seconds to this point, then you're holding it, you're contracting it isometrically here, contracting the muscle that you're actually going to be stretching. So in this case, you'd be contracting the hamstring isometrically, and then you release it, and then you move into a further stretch for slow gradual movement over 30 seconds. The contract relax technique is once again that passive pre-stretch, then an actual concentric muscle action where you're contracting the hamstring against resistance that your partner is providing. So you're trying to move the leg back against your partner. So rather than just the isometric hold, you're trying to actively move that foot and move that leg back towards your partner, and your partner is resisting that motion. Then you relax that contraction, and then you passively stretch it with your partner's assistance for another 30 seconds. That's deemed to be a more effective way of initiating this PNF effect. The hold relax with antagonist contraction technique is during that third phase, that passive stretch. You concentrically contract the antagonist, and then release it, and that allows you even a greater amount of stretch, because the proprioceptors in that quadricep in this situation, you're contracting that quadricep. Once you relax it, those proprioceptors get fooled a little bit, and it allows you to stretch that hamstring even further in that situation. A hold relax with antagonist contraction tends to get the most attention, gets the most kudos as far as being the most active PNF stretch, because you are using both reciprocal and autogenic inhibition, and you're utilizing both of those techniques, both of those methodologies, in order to fool those proprioceptors. All right, that brings us to the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.